This move immediately claims central space and opens diagonals for the queen and bishop, setting the stage for common opening systems like the king's pawn game or Sicilian defense. This move mirrors white's central pawn advance, immediately contesting the d4 square and opening diagonals for both the queen and king's bishop, leading to classical open game positions. This develops a knight towards the center and attacks black's e5 pawn, initiating a central pawn battle common in many open games. Developing the knight to c6 supports the e5 pawn and prepares to contest the center, which is a common and solid response in many classical openings. This move initiates the Raul Lopez, a fundamental opening where white develops the bishop to attack the knight, indirectly pressuring black's central pawn and preparing to castle. This move prepares to contest the center and supports the pawn on e5, transitioning into the Philidor defense, a solid but sometimes passive setup. This move develops another knight towards the center and supports the pawn on e4, preparing to control more central squares and potentially castle soon. This move, nf6, develops a knight and attacks white's central pawn, preparing to castle and contesting control of the e4-e5 square. This move, d4, challenges black's central pawn and opens lines for white's pieces, aiming to seize the initiative and exploit the Raul Lopez structure's inherent tensions. This move develops the bishop and prepares to castle, reinforcing the central pawn structure and anticipating white's aggressive pawn push. Castling kingside completes development and secures the king, preparing to connect the rooks for future action on the central files or potentially an attack. This move prepares to develop the queenside knight, solidify the pawn structure, and potentially challenge white's central control while preparing for kingside castling. This move aims to reinforce the central pawn and prepare for the eventual d5 break, while also offering a retreat square for the bishop on e1 if necessary. This move, by capturing the pawn on d4, initiates a tactical sequence that challenges white's central pawn structure and opens lines for black's pieces. This move recaptures the pawn with a knight, simplifying the position and opening lines for white's pieces while also preparing to develop the other knight. Black recaptures the pawn, opening the e-file for white's rook and accepting a slightly more open position with potential dynamic counterplay. This capture resolves the tension in the center and develops the queen, but opens the queen to potential attacks from black's developing pieces. This move voluntarily exchanges a bishop for a knight, opening the d-file for your rook and centralizing your queen after recapturing. But it also surrenders your strong bishop pair without immediate compensation. Capturing the bishop on b5 regains the pawn material lost earlier and frees the c-pawn to advance, potentially creating central pressure and attacking black's queenside. This move is designed to disrupt white's bishop on b5 and win back the pawn lost on d4. Developing the knight to c3 reinforces the pawn on d4 and prepares to contest control of the d5 square, aiming to create a more harmonious piece development. Black castles kingside, securing their monarch and preparing to connect the rooks for future central action or queenside play. This move directly challenges the pinned knight on f6, aiming to disrupt black's kingside defense and potentially exploit the weakened pawn structure if the knight is forced to move. This move strategically repositions the knight to a more active central square, preparing to challenge white's control of the d4 pawn and potentially exploit the weakened dark squares around white's king after castling. By exchanging the bishop for the knight, white simplifies the position and removes black's active knight, aiming to exploit the resulting pawn structure and control the central squares. This recapture on e7 is a natural response, aiming to maintain material equality while also activating the queen and preparing to contest the central files. This move develops the knight to a strong central outpost, preparing to challenge black's queen and potentially exploit the weakened dark squares on black's kingside. This move retreats the queen to a safer square, allowing for the development of the kingside pieces and preparing to challenge white's central pawn control. This move prepares to activate the rook by shifting it to the kingside, aiming to support an eventual kingside pawn push or to participate in an attack on black's king if opportunities arise. This move strategically repositions the knight to a central outpost, challenging white's bishop and preparing to contest the important d-file, aiming to improve piece coordination and defensive capabilities. This move repositions the rook to the g-file, aiming to create attacking possibilities on the kingside by potentially opening lines for the rook to penetrate or by supporting a kingside pawn advance. This move prevents white's rook from potentially attacking the black queen on the third rank and prepares to challenge white's control of the g-file. This move aggressively challenges black's central pawn structure, aiming to open lines for white's pieces and potentially exploit the weakened kingside. This move challenges white's central pawn and opens lines for black's rooks, preparing to contest the d4 pawn and activate the c8 bishop. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, eyeing the weakened b7 pawn and supporting a potential advance of the c pawn, while simultaneously defending the d4 pawn. This move prepares to bring the rook back into the game via the g-file, aiming to challenge white's control of the open file and potentially support a kingside initiative. This aggressive pawn thrust aims to disrupt black's king safety by opening lines and creating attacking possibilities, but it also weakens white's own king-pawn structure, demanding careful follow-up. The move 19, qf8 aims to reposition the queen to a more defensive square, preparing to support the kingside and potentially contest the open f-file once white's pawn advances. The move qb3 repositions the queen to a more active square, supporting a potential advance on the kingside and simultaneously eyeing black's slightly vulnerable queenside. This move prepares to contest the e-file and potentially reroute the king to a safer square, anticipating white's efforts to open lines towards the kingside. This knight's repositioning to f4 aims to gain control of central squares, potentially support a kingside attack, and prepare for further piece development or pawn advances. This move repositions the knight to a central outpost where it can control important squares, eye the kingside, and potentially support a pawn advance on the kingside or prepare for a rook lift. Capturing the b7 pawn creates immediate threats on black's queenside and forces them to react defensively, aiming to exploit the open lines and potential king safety issues. This move challenges white's queen on b7, forcing it to retreat and allowing black to gain valuable tempi on the queenside while disrupting white's central control. This move captures a pawn but weakens white's kingside pawn structure, potentially opening lines for black's rook and queen to attack the white king. This move initiates a dangerous counterattack on white's vulnerable queenside, aiming to exploit the exposed nature of the queen after 23. Qxa6. White's 24. Rb3 aims to create a mating attack on black's weakened kingside by transferring the rook to the third rank and exploiting the open g-file, while also defending against potential counterplay on the b-file. This move captures a pawn and opens up the c-file, aiming to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure and create active counterplay for black's pieces. This move prepares to recapture the rook on b2 and regain material equality while also activating the rook for potential play along the now open b-file. This move addresses the immediate threat of the white knight on f4 and prepares to defend the h-pawn, while also potentially creating a defensive pawn chain along the kingside. The knight's check at g6 forces the black king to move, disrupting black's defense and potentially opening lines for white's attack, while also defending the pawn on f5. This recapture allows black to simplify the position, trading off material and aiming for a more manageable endgame despite white's material advantage. This pawn capture opens the f-file for your rook, creating immediate attacking potential against black's weakened kingside. This move activates the rook on the open e-file, preparing to contest it with white's rook and potentially create counterplay against white's kingside, which has been weakened by the pawn advances. White's rb8 initiates a critical attack on the pinned black rook, forcing black to defend the rook indirectly and creating a dynamic situation on the open b-file. Black correctly recaptures the pawn, regaining material and centralizing the rook on the now open e-file, which is crucial for the upcoming defensive struggle. This move capitalizes on black's weakened kingside after the knight sacrifice and pawn push, aiming to open lines for further attack by forcing the exchange of queens and thereby simplifying into a more advantageous endgame for white.